All right, welcome back to Empires of the Future, and I'm back.
Yeah, good to have you back, Jackson. I
mean-
enjoyed our last podcast, but I did miss you, getting to hear your voice.
And Kira did such a great job. So
She did.
that was a good one, but it's good to be back.
Yeah.
And we're back in book mode now.
Yeah, for all of you people who got bored out of your mind listening to our last book podcast, well, get ready because we're doing another one. Yeah, we're pretty excited about this one, though. Not that we weren't excited about the last one, but Jackson, tell them about what book we're going to be reading.
So this is Mere Christianity. If you have ever talked to me about books and asked my favorite books, look, this one's up there, and it's, look, in part, yes, because I'm a Christian, but man, this book is a phenomenal example of clear thinking, of careful argumentation, and even one thing that I'll say about it straight out of the gate, just as an argument for why reading it is, man, this guy doesn't waste your time. It made me think of books differently because the book moves along. And it is the case that if you miss a sentence or a paragraph, you will, if like your mind wanders, I don't know if this happened to you, but if your mind wanders and then you come back, you will have to pick up what you missed because usually most sentences matter and he's going to build off of the previous sentence, But that's another thing that I hadn't really encountered before this book is, look, this is a carefully written book. And it made me realize that a lot of the books that I had been reading kind of meander a fair amount and offer more fluff, repeat themselves. And frankly, one thing I can say, this affected me to say, like, look, I'm not into the kind of books that repeat themselves a lot. Yeah. It gave me a more of a hint of what kind of books I want to read.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I had proposed to you. You never did get back to me if you liked it. But this being December, this podcast should come out a little bit before Christmas, at least, if not a couple weeks before. I said we ought to title this this podcast series "Merry Christianity."
Merry Christianity.
You get what I'm saying? It's like half Merry Christmas, half Mere Christianity, or maybe Mere Christmasianity. I don't know.
That one's pretty good too.
Let's workshop it. We'll workshop it. But yeah, it's a really good book, and exactly like you said, there's he doesn't waste your time. That's why I have to listen to this as I'm reading it, or do something like that, or something like taking notes intentionally while I'm reading it. And so I do that. Actually, so I've read the book before. You've read the book before, at least once. How many times have you read the book, Mere Christianity?
So, and I feel like we're back in disclaimer mode because I don't do this a lot. But this is a book that has been so impactful on me. I've probably read it at least 10 plus times.
That's amazing.
And it's one, too, that I think it's so useful, obviously for its explanation of Christianity, but also as kind of training in clear thinking that I've gone through it every summer with the internship that we do here and other times with people. It's just one of those books that when you have a book that the content is good and the style is good, kind of the methodology behind it, to me, this book is worth reading. If you don't even want to know anything about Christianity, it's worth reading from the standpoint of this is such an example of careful writing that is not trying to waste people's time, that values other people's time. And I don't think there's that many books that you can say that about.
Yeah, probably not. Yeah, so that's impressive that you've read this 10 times. I've only read it once, and now when I say read it, some people won't like this, but I didn't actually read it so much as listen to it.
You listen to it, that's fine.
So this is my first time reading through it, like holding the book in my hand, reading through it. And I am as well listening as I read through it because I just find that that's the best way for me to, with any book, comprehend it as I'm reading it. I did the same thing with the last book. But is it cool if we jump right in? Yeah. Let's hop to it. So we want to start off with the preface. One of our elders just preached this last Sunday on the importance of not skipping the prologue. Or in this case, the preface.
And this book, the preface matters quite a bit.
Yeah, the preface matters because really in the preface, what C.S. Lewis does is he basically lays out what his goal is in writing, which is a really helpful thing to do. You don't have to guess, you don't have to wonder. he tells you outright, this is my goal in writing. Here's why I've made certain decisions that I've made, why I've added certain things, omitted other things. Some people might not like it, but I did it with a specific goal in mind, and my hope is that I'm going to reach that goal. And I think he does pretty well. I'm not one to sit here and criticize C.S. Lewis anyway if I didn't think he did it well. I think he did it well. What are some of the things that he points out in the preface as far as his goal and point in writing?
Right. So mere Christianity does not exist as a denomination. And so he has to tell you what he's trying to argue towards. And basic Christianity in a very kind of simple form, without denominational distinctives. Not that that exists, because this is the thing about it. And you know, I hadn't thought about this, but we're going to have to speak to sort of. You have churches today that say they're, quote, non-denominational. Usually what is happening there is they actually are a denomination. They just, their branding doesn't want to tell you that because it's not trendy.
Yeah.
Because you have to. You read the Bible, and you're going to need to come to conclusions about what is happening in the Lord's Supper, how best to do baptism, just to pick up a couple of examples. And so what he says is, look, mere Christianity is basically saying Christians should be baptized. And they'll have to sort that out. But he's going to argue that Christians should be baptized, right? The Lord's Supper should take place. All the details, that's what church life is for. But he's arguing for living the Christian life in sort of a general way, because what he's going to start from is a place of non-belief altogether, and move towards a belief in the basics of Christianity, which is, you know, what he's after.
Yeah. And he makes some important clarifications too. He talks about the importance of the words we use and how sometimes we can use a word often and it can begin to kind of lose its meaning. And that can sometimes happen with the word Christian, where it can sort of be like refined or perhaps redefined to mean not so much a, distinctive religious category, but it could mean just something that is good, like she's a good Christian woman, or there's a Christian work ethic, or things like that. And he does make the point to say, no, when I'm using the term Christian, I'm using it in its most original formal sense, the same sense that it was first used in Acts. That is disciples, those who accept the teaching of the apostles. That is who I'm referring to when I talk about Christians and what Christianity is. Yeah. And I think he makes a helpful kind of statement along with that to say that it can be very unhelpful, especially when you're looking at denominational distinctives. And anyone who has talked to me about, like, the importance of doctrine, the importance of ecclesiology, all these things, even in this podcast, has probably come out. I care about all that stuff a great deal.
Yes.
I really do. But it is an unfortunate thing that oftentimes people will be hasty in declaring someone to be not a Christian. And he argues we need to be slow to do that. In fact, in many cases, that's very unhelpful. While it's not necessarily unhelpful or unwise to say someone could be a bad Christian, it's far better to say you're a bad Christian rather than saying you are not a Christian. That can be a true and right statement, while you can still recognize that person is a brother or sister in Christ. And yeah, that's his point. We talked about this illustration that he gives of what he wants to do in writing. He creates kind of this illustration where there's a house. And in this house, there's a hallway that you enter into, and then there are various doors that lead to other rooms. His goal is to get people into that hallway. All the different doors represent different denominations, different flavors, if you will, of Christianity. And he makes the point, my goal in writing this book is not to get you into any of those doors, but simply to get you into that hallway. Right. It is then up to you to decide which of these doors holds most accurately to what we would consider to be the truth, and to enter into that door for yourself. But he makes clear, my point in writing is not to get you into any of those doors. Now, he's honest about which door he's in. He's writing as a member of the Church of England, and he's unapologetic about that. Right. He's not trying to say none of that matters at all, but essentially to say, let's start with a different discussion for those of you who are not yet in the house, who are not yet in the hallway. Let's get you into that hallway first. And once you're in there, we can talk about those different places. But he goes on to say that inside those rooms, that is where there is warmth. That is where there is food to be found. That is where there is sustenance, all these things. So you are not intended to live in this hallway. And so I think one of the critiques I've heard about Mere Christianity is that it undervalues or undermines even like theology and distinctives. I think anyone who reads that hasn't read the book well, because he makes clear that's not his point.
Right, and he is very clear that life happens in the doors. There's no living. Nobody lives in the hallway. Right. You just go through the hallway to get to the doors.
That's a temporary waiting room.
Right, yeah. and that's his entire analogy, and so yeah, I think that makes sense very much. And what you said is so helpful, and I think one of the most helpful kind of habits of mind that C.S. Lewis teaches, beginning even there in the preface, which is, look, the word Christian should have useful content. That word should mean something, such as those who follow the apostles' doctrine. If you want to say, well, but couldn't it be more than that? Well, be careful what you mean by more, because a lot of times what people do is we say, well, she's a good Christian woman, and all you mean by that is you like her. And if you are trying to say you like her, well, just say you like her and use those words, because we already have those words. If you empty other words of their meaning, such as she's a good Christian, she is a professing and faithful Christian, that means something as long as there's content to those words. Right. And as having heard that from him for the first time, something like 22 years ago, and having seen the habit, which if you think about it, this is a habit that is so common in our people, in our culture, which is to change out words that mean something and just use them for another way of saying, I like it. And you can have simple idea. I mean, this has been done with like the word awesome in the 80s. Awesome means being in a state of awe where you literally stop talking because you're so amazed. And awesome is used now as, oh man, I painted my room and it looks awesome. It's like, well, look, if you didn't stand mouth open in the middle of your room, it actually doesn't look awesome. And I'm to the point to where I'm so tired of so many words being emptied of their meaning that I hear people say things, and sometimes I will question them on, look, we have to use words in a manner that has content. Yeah. Otherwise, you can literally say nothing if you're not careful, other than you like it. And what a terrible situation you're in if you think you're saying something and you're not even saying anything other than I like it. Yeah. And good. We all like a lot of things, but in your own mind, I hope you know what you're saying. And that's a habit of mine that I think is one of his most helpful. Say, look, he even says, they meant well. When people do this, they might mean well, but they are emptying words of their meaning and not adding anything to the discussion. So.
Right. Yeah, so that, man, if I were to sum up the preface, that's what I would say. Can I mention, like, one thing about all of that if I'm being honest, I do still struggle with? Yeah. Like, if there was an issue that I had with, I think, a little bit of the writings of Mere Christianity, which, by the way, I think it's a good book. Obviously, we're going through it. I'm a proponent of it. You can find it in our church, right? But he does kind of... There are times, I think, when it is right to say someone is not a Christian. Yeah. Okay? And even someone who is calling themselves a Christian. I think the problem is we sometimes rush to that too quickly. But, and we can talk more about this if you want to, or we can say this and let it go. But there are even some doctrinal issues that I think C.S. Lewis maybe has declared to be not important for whether or not someone is a Christian, that I would say, well, brother C.S., brother Clive, that is important enough that, if they deny this or accept this, they are in essence distorting the gospel, and therefore it would be right to say they're not a Christian. And we can talk more about if you want.
Sure, I'd
we
say
can
that'll
just
come
let
up
that
along
go.
the way. It
Yeah.
reminds me that he says in there that he was writing letters to various friends of his, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic, and that certain ones, well, you didn't say enough about doctrine here, or you didn't say enough about the warming of one's heart here, and he said, okay, I hear you from where you sit. And so that's it. I think the book is fun because you should keep looking at it and going, man, there's so much about Christianity that's important that I see now that where I stand, and keep on judging. Okay, how did he do in his goal of speaking for mere Christianity, for Christianity in a basic kind of form? Because I think it even, since he's talking so much about the basics of what Christianity is, you do have different opinions about that over the years, and that's fine. It is a book that is worth reading multiple times at different phases because you can reflect on it in so many different ways. And then the other thing that everyone's going to see is that different things are focused on in different sections, and so that this first section, I think, is the most kind of high level, but later on, I would say that we will have more discussions about that because of where he goes.
Yeah, I think so. I think, I'll just go ahead and say it. I think in this preface, he seems to sort of gloss over the importance of the Reformation. And I guess in my mind, that sort of bothers me a little bit, if I'm being honest.
Sure.
I'll let it rest right there, though, and we can move on if you want.
Sure. So, before we jump into kind of the content, I think it's helpful to say published in 1952, but based on radio talks he had made during World War II. During World War II, while we sat across an ocean, and yes, the bombing of Pearl Harbor was injurious to us as a nation, we were not just a short flight from Germany as England was, and as the bombings did happen in London and various other parts of England. And so they put him on the radio. They said, look, this is a time where our people are scared and we need something foundational to encourage them with. And having fought in World War I as he did, he cared about his country. He had a unique place. And so he did get on the radio and gave addresses about Christianity, about things that people could believe in that would give them strength. I think that was the call he really received, and that eventually became this book. Yeah, that is the origin of this book, and I think such an important thing to know about it, and also just a great story, a powerful story. Yeah, it gives us some added context as to when you're reading this book and you think like this was in a lecture given to, a country at war. Some of the things carry a little bit more weight, especially when it refers to things dealing with, wartime and stuff like that, which he does regularly throughout the book. Carries a little more weight when you think of it in its context like that. Yeah. So let me ask you, as we're jumping into to chapter 1 here, do you have a favorite argument for the existence of God? Oh man, we've talked about this. I'm not a big philosophy guy, and so I oftentimes forget the names of the various arguments for the existence of God. But some of the more compelling things I've heard, I think, are with regards to the ontological argument, I think. But so for example, the idea that when you look at a painting, how do you know that the painting had a painter? Yeah. Well, you can look at the painting and know that it didn't just happen on its own. The painting itself is a testament to the fact that there is a painter. Is that an appeal to beauty? That's the cosmological argument. Cosmological argument? So it's the argument from causation. Somebody made that. There you go. Same thing with architecture. You can look at architecture and know, well, how do you know there was an architect? Well, because the architecture is there. It is a testament to the fact that someone designed it. When you look at the human body or creation in general, whatever, pick the thing. It didn't just happen. It is in itself a testament to a designer, to a creator. That in and of itself, I find to be really compelling. I know some people that don't, though. Some people are more compelled by other arguments. I think the argument C.S. Lewis makes here, which, if I understand it correctly, is an argument from, what would his be? An argument from morality? It's called the moral argument. The moral argument? Mm-hmm. Yeah. The moral argument to say, we all understand, which is what he says in this first chapter,
we all understand that there is objective moral standard.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone does. Yes. Even people who try and act like there isn't, try and say there isn't, they still live as though there is.
Right.
So I think his argument is a really compelling one.
Yes, I agree. It's helpful, especially for where he's going. You mentioned the argument from beauty for the last, quite a few years. It's been one that I have really liked, just because it's very broad and poetic. Just basically say, like, look, there is the music of Bach, therefore there is God. There are sunsets, and they are beautiful, therefore there is God. You either get it or you don't. There is something in us that says, this didn't just come from nowhere, nor does it make sense that a universe of nothingness should have these sorts of things out of nowhere. And so I like that one. I think the moral argument is helpful, and so obviously we'll get into that one because he's gonna use that as sort of a jumping off point for this whole first section.
Right.
I will say that most of the time too, the argument just from your personal life, the argument from the fact that, look, how do you get a guy like me who was wrecked by pride and lust and jealousy and just with no hope to begin to be drawn out of that, to move to a place. I mean, I can just remember what it's like to not be able to think straight at all because of all the things that were just, I can look back now and see all the things that were just wrecking my heart every day as I was yanked back and forth by sort of every in part whim, but in part just junk that was going on with me. But to have life come into me and then it's great to be talking about this in the context of this book too, because this book represents a lot of training in just how to think straight and how to not be, as the scriptures say, blown and tossed by the winds of everything that comes by. Because that is not just a few words for me. That is years of my life that I can remember well. And, I've had a lot of people who have helped me in terms of my heart and in terms of clear thinking, but in terms of something that's accessible to anybody, this book, there is not a single item other than the Bible, which is obviously supernatural. This book is the work by a Christian person that I just say, look, this is helpful on multiple layers, and I have so much gratitude just that it was written because of how much it has helped me.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And you get that in the way he writes things. This is what happens with me when I read this book, is I read something he writes and it's like, seems so like, well, that's just common sense. It just makes sense. But it's like, well, I've never considered it like that before, but that's exactly right. Even as he talks about, he opens the book with like, you've seen people arguing before. And they're like, hey, that's not fair. You shouldn't have done that. Hey, leave him alone. He's not bothering you. You see these little arguments. And in arguments between people, when someone has been wronged or they feel they've been wronged or whatever, all of these different sorts of arguments and issues, there is an appeal to a moral standard in all of these, even if they don't realize that there is. And that's happening around us all the time.
Right.
But when we hear C.S. Lewis state it and put it into words and basically point it out to us, it's like, wow, yeah. That's true. Just having him point to it and say, "Look, that's happening."
Right.
It's really helpful. And he points to that and says, "This happening, this appeal to an earthly standard is happening, and it's right that it's happening, right? And everyone does it, regardless of what your background or philosophy or whatever is. Everyone does this, and with regards to like how they interact with each other, all this kind of stuff."
Yeah, and I mean, getting at the point of saying, okay, when you hear this arguing, what are they after? And he says what they're after is they're trying to prove that they followed a real standard. And whatever content you're assigning to the word real, look, that we believe there is a real standard for how people ought to behave. And yes, there is some confusion, and especially when you get into details, that's what we are arguing about is, well, did I follow the standard or not? But what he's saying is there is a standard. Nobody just walks around and kind of goes, oh, I'm one of the kinds of people who actually, I know standards. I don't do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I don't operate according to any. If you run into one of those kinds of people and they really mean it, you're going to want to get very far away from them, because if they really mean it, that means I may give you a kiss on the cheek. I may shoot you with a gun. I have no standards.
Yeah.
Nobody's like that, nor do we want anybody to be like that, because we do believe there's a standard.
Yeah. We not only believe that there is a standard, but there is an understanding that all humans have that we are bound to that standard.
Right.
So that when the standard is transgressed, something has been done wrong. The question of, hey, you pushed me. You transgressed the standard. I didn't do anything to you. You assaulted me in that way.
Right.
The response isn't, yeah, I did, but who cares if I transgressed? Who cares if I, no, like there is an understanding that everyone has that it was transgressed. And if someone did something, their response is not, yes, I transgressed, but it doesn't matter. The response is usually to explain how they didn't actually transgress.
That's right.
Or that, okay, well, maybe they did, but it was because an exception that applied in this case. There was never an argumentation for it. There is a moral standard, but transgressing it means nothing.
Right.
Rarely. And like you said, if you meet that person, it's not a person you want to be around.
Right.
Not a person you can trust.
Right. And I mean, getting all the way down to the ground with this, like just simple things like, I shared my lunch with you yesterday and then I forgot my lunch today. Can you help me out? No, they don't have to, but the expectation is there because there is a moral law.
Right.
And all of what follows, and in a lot of ways, it's like we're swimming in this every day. The only reason why you don't think about it is because it's the ocean that you're swimming in every day. And so we all then say, well, here's why I can't share my lunch with you today. But you're offering a justification because there's a law there. And that's where he's trying to get here at the beginning. And here's another reason why this is important. Just this last week, I listened to a podcast that was actually about this same era, about 4 women who were at Oxford, and there's a story about them that they encounter C.S. Lewis. This is, by the way, the most recent Thinking in Public with Al Mohler. If you haven't listened to it yet, it was a good one. And A.J. Ayer was the most prominent ethicist, and he had, in this time, the most prominent ethical position that was accepted is subjectivism, that there really isn't right or wrong. And if anybody's not spent too much time in any sort of like academic settings are weird because there's these overarching theories, and they just, on that campus, they're just, well, this is really important because this is what the smartest people we know of think. Well, in this time, that was the dominant idea, that there's not really ethical realism. There's just, what you're saying is that you prefer the good that you think. Okay, put that against the backdrop of World War II, where Adolf Hitler is murdering Jews, killing anyone who opposes him along with the Nazi party. Do we really think that it's just inconvenient? Do you really think that that's that is nothing more than, well, for the people who are being persecuted, sure, they would want something different, but it's not genuinely evil. Mm-hmm. No, we don't. Most people who are honest would immediately admit, no, we know that that's evil.
Right.
To kill someone based upon their nationality or based upon them opposing you in a political manner, right, that's wrong.
Even if you can't explain why, you know it is.
Right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And he makes that point. He says, we know certain things are wrong, even if we can't explain why. So, by the way, we never did mention, we're looking at book 1 this week. So C.S. Lewis' book, Mere Christianity, is broken down into, I think, 4 books, right? Mm-hmm. Book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, and each composed of 2 or 3, 4 or 5 chapters. And so specifically in this book, which the book is entitled, let's see here, I've already forgotten it, Right and Wrong as Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. That's how he titles this book. That gives you a clue to kind of where he's going. But yeah, he's appealing to moral law and that it obviously exists. And he makes the point at the end of the first chapter of this book. He says that he makes these 2 points. Quote, first, that human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way and cannot really get rid of it. And secondly, that they do not, in fact, behave in that way. they know that the law of nature, which he's using to refer to the moral law, they break it. These two facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. This is his starting point. This is what he says is the foundation, that we all recognize that there is a moral law and that we all break it. And in case you don't already see where this is going, you can see the hints of this in the gospel, in scriptures. We're going to get into that a little more later. But then in chapter 2, he kind of explains why it is that this is a moral law that is imposed upon us. And by imposed, I mean it is imprinted on our hearts, if you will, by something outside of us, and that it is not simply a social convention or simply a part of our instincts, but it is something entirely different. He makes the point that the moral law is what guides us, and it guides us to prioritize even certain instincts over another.
Yes.
So, for example, if you hear someone screaming for help, you have multiple instincts at play there. One instinct is to preserve yourself, to run away from the danger. Another instinct is that, I should go help this person because it is for the social good. Well, it is the moral law that causes you to prioritize one instinct over another.
Right.
It is the moral law that guides you into, embracing one instinct to the neglect of the other in that specific case. He uses a really good illustration. You're a musician, and so you would appreciate this. I like to think I'm a musician sometimes, but he uses the example of a piano, that our instincts are like keys on a piano. Now, there's all kinds of keys on the piano,
right.
And even all the keys, there's not bad keys and good keys, but it is the moral law that gives us the tune which we are to play using these keys,
right.
using these various instincts.
Right.
That some are to be played at certain times while others are not. Some are to be played a little bit louder while others are not. And I think that was a really helpful illustration to say, look, the point is that the moral law is something above our instincts, something that it encourages us, calls us, compels us to embrace certain instincts, prioritize them over others at certain times for certain purposes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's super helpful because I think you're going to have immediately this thought of like, wait, are we sure that that this moral law is really there? And he has a great way of sort of saying, like, you may have think that I hoodwinked you basically, but really look at it straight. Isn't this what you're doing? Mm-hmm. And yes, you do have instincts, but think about anybody who's been in a situation, a baby is about to step off of a ledge, and there are instincts inside of you. Well, it's not my problem. Mm-hmm. There are instincts inside of you. Maybe I should do something. Well, you have to choose. Mm-hmm. And where does that come from? It can't just be another instinct that is saying to you, oh, well, you better choose one of these. Well, that would just be yet another voice that is not any different than the instincts. There's something deeper going on here. And so that's really helpful. And then as we've been getting into this too, I could think that if anybody who might be thinking, oh, well, but we've learned that morality varies in different cultures. It does, but not necessarily in the way you might think. There is no culture where he brings this one up, where traitors, where people who betray their people are just, well, here we think those people are great.
Yeah, right.
Like the basic gravity of morality does last, and so that's helpful because if you've not looked into that very much, it might just be a thought that you had. But look, no, strikingly, there are many things morally that are just cross-cultural.
Yeah. He says, sure, there are slight differences, slight variations, but they're way smaller than you might think.
Yep.
Way less impactful than you might think. What we actually see is that what we share in common with regards to basic understandings of right and wrong actually are pretty broadly accepted worldwide cross cultures.
And up to this very moment, this is bringing to mind Jonathan Haidt's work on moral foundations theory. He has been to multiple cultures across the world, studied them, and he says, look, loyalty in every culture is valued, and in many cultures valued more, but there is no culture that just goes, oh, we don't think loyalty is good. Fairness, reciprocity. This is if you look into Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, you'll see he's done a lot of work, even up to this has come out in like the last few years, to say, strikingly, there are quite a few things across cultures that are just morally consistent.
Yeah, self-sacrifice. Right. There's not a culture that exists that doesn't understand the moral rightness, the goodness of someone being sacrificial in that kind of way. And what that points us to, and he makes this point again, is that there are societies that we can identify are have a better or worse morality. And that is true. There are some societies we can point to and say, like, they have a bad morality. Like, their morality is not as good as this other society or as our society.
In a certain area. So you could say, look, if theft is more prevalent, well, then that's worse.
Yeah. Or I think you could even say, like, broader scale, like, what are some of the things that they are prioritizing or allowing? I would look at our culture today and say, look at what it is that the United States, by and large, is perpetuating as good, right, or even acceptable.
Yeah.
Even things which are evil.
Yeah.
And we can look at that and say, our society has, in that way, become a worse society morally.
Yeah.
When we look at other cultures, and people do this on every side of the aisle. There's plenty of people from a conservative perspective that look at the culture of the United States or cultures that embrace things like abortion or sexual immorality of various kinds, and say that is morally worse than this other country that doesn't do that.
Yeah.
But also on the left, people would say, that country suppresses and has made it illegal to engage in certain practices, whether LGBTQ practices or abortion. They'd say it in the other direction. Mm-hmm. Whatever you're doing in those cases, and whichever side you're doing it from, you are implying that there is a standard that one society is either closer to or further away from. The closer they are to that standard, the more morally good, the morally right they are. Yep. The further away from they are from the standard, the worse their morality is. And that's what you're doing. You are, if there is someone who is worse morally or a society that is worse morally, then you have to say worse compared to what? Mm-hmm. You are comparing them to a standard. So there is an understanding, even whatever position you're coming at it from, whatever direction, if you are making a claim that someone or some society has a worse morality or better morality, it is because you are comparing them to a standard to which you see they are either closer to or further away from.
Right. So it stands. If you're reading this book, chapter 2 is just about those two objections. Of is this more than instinct or social convention? And I think we've probably even brought up some more objections. And so he does a good job of considering what concerns you might raise and moving stepwise. And then he makes another step in chapter 3. So we know the law, but we don't follow it. What is chapter 3 called, by the way? I don't remember what chapter.
Lies behind the law. Yeah. Oh, no, wait, that's chapter 4. The reality of the law is what chapter 3 is. Yeah.
Yeah, and chapter 3 is just a helpful establishing chapter. Think about how strange this is, though, that if you know the law, if you know the moral law, but you don't follow it, you're kind of like a rock that doesn't fall when you throw it, or you're like a fish that doesn't swim. That's just a really weird thing.
Yeah. He does make distinctions between sort of like the law of gravity versus the moral law. The law of gravity, which is imposed on, what's imposed on everyone and everything. But you take a rock, for example, and you drop it. It fell because the law of gravity commanded it to, or compelled it to. It had no choice but to fall. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the law of gravity is, as he says, simply describes what a thing does. Mm-hmm. So the law of gravity says that the rock will fall, and the law of gravity says that because if you pick up a rock and let it go, it falls. So it states what it does. The moral law is different in a sense, in that the moral law doesn't simply state what human beings do, rather it states what we ought to do.
Right.
But as we know, so often we don't.
Right.
We don't live according to the moral law. And so there is a difference between, say, for example, the laws of physics and the moral law, and that the laws of physics, laws of gravity, these kinds of laws that explain nature around us are doing just that. They're just explaining what it does. Yep. It's different with the moral law, because the moral law explains what human beings ought to do,
right?
But it is not the thing that dictates what we do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a part of what it means to be human, and that's kind of some of the point he's getting at here too, is that we live in the human experience, like you said earlier, and a part of that human experience, we know that we are unlike a rock, unlike a tree, unlike dirt. We have a sort of will and can live outside of accordance with the moral law, with which has been we know to be true, and we know we ought to be bound to.
Right.
And so there is, yeah, go ahead.
And this is huge because talk about cognitive dissonance. This is something we've been living with our entire lives, but something that is very heavy to live with, which is A, morality's real. B, you're not living up to the standard. Yeah. C, if you're honest, you're not even living up to whatever your, quote, negotiated standard is. Mm-hmm. And this is so important because this is the world that Christianity speaks into, this world of facts that you know there is a moral law, but you also know you're not following it. But that puts you in a very tenuous and tense position to try to justify yourself and why you're doing the best that you can given the circumstances. And, you know, but I do better most days. I was tired today. And all these things that we all say to each other because we all are. I mean, I have kids now. And when you have kids, you look at them and you think about what it was like when you were a kid, and you see, you know, your kids begin to negotiate morality and trying to sort out what's right and wrong. And then you see your kids get really mad at their brother or sister and they fly off the handle, and you talk through, now what are you doing there? And then they give you the justifications for why, well, I had to punch him.
He left me no choice.
He took my toy. I had to.
What other recourse did I
That's
have?
right.
Yeah.
You know, and again, this book is useful for so many contexts, but that is another one that's very useful.
Yeah, but you know, kind of what he gets at too is that this moral law, and when we think about the reality of the law, is that it hints at, it points to something, some reality beyond ours, as in above ours, yet pressing upon ours. And here you begin to see hints of sort of where he's going as he's building his argument here, because we know, every one of us, as he's already demonstrated, we all know that there is a moral standard, that morality and the moral law exists, and therefore we have to recognize that it comes from somewhere,
right?
Which is where he goes in the next chapter, which is what lies behind the law. He begins to dig a little deeper into that.
Before you go there, this one analogy, he's great with analogies. And certainly one of the reasons you'll still want to take a look at the book, I'm sure we'll mention some of his analogies, but he's always good about having multiple analogies for anything. And this one is so helpful that sometimes you call a dog a bad dog because it just did something inconvenient to you. You know, the dog peed on the carpet. That's different than actually a dog who is not fulfilling his purpose, which is the ultimate meaning of a good or bad dog. We have a nature, and are you acting in accordance with your nature? When your dog is peeing on the carpet, in a lot of ways, he's acting in accordance with his nature. But it's a, quote, bad dog if that's inconvenient for you. But he's talking about the sense in which, what if we're not acting in conforming with our nature, with what we were made to do? What if we're not living for the purpose that we were made for? What does that mean? And what are the consequences for that?
Yeah. Because what you begin to see as well is that human beings are unique in that we are able to live not in accord with what the standard is that's been given, with the law that has been set for us.
Yep.
Unlike he says the same thing about a tree. You can, maybe joking around, say that a tree is a bad tree because it's not giving you the kind of shade that you wish it were. But in reality, that tree is doing exactly as it, according to the laws that govern it, exactly what it could only have done. And its soil and with the air and rain supply that it has had, it can do nothing other than what it's doing. It is actually living perfectly according to the law.
That tree is living its best life. You leave that tree alone.
Its best life now. That's right. But it is different with human beings, that we are able, unlike trees, unlike dogs, we are able to live outside of accord with the moral law, the law that we ought to be governed by.
Right.
Which then begs the question, okay, what happens when we do not live accord? What is the result of all this?
Yep.
Which he's going to tell you.
Yep.
He's not going to keep it from you. He begins to get into chapter 4, what lies behind the law. Again, building his argument. Behind the law, in essence, this is his argument, there is a mind. The mind of a creator, specifically, as he points out, the mind of God. And now he really begins to, I don't want to say pull back the curtain and you see where he's going, but in a sense, that is what he's doing. He argues against the materialist perspective that all that we can see and experience and partake in is all there is, because he points out that it doesn't actually answer a lot of the questions that we have. He says, supposing science, this is a quote, supposing science ever became complete so that it knew every single thing in the whole universe, it is not plain that the questions, why is there a universe? Why does it go on just as it does? Has it any meaning? Would remain just as they were. In other words, you could know everything there is to know about this material universe, and all of those questions would still remain.
Yep.
That's an interesting quandary, and a question that the materialist has no answer to and can provide no answer to. All they can tell you is that it does exist.
Yep.
All they can tell you is that there is a universe, and that it does go on as it does, but it can't answer questions of meaning, of why it is, of how it is. It's left without answers. Certainly, the answer of morality can never be fully addressed by what we can experience materially.
Right. And I think it's handy and helpful that he sort of disabuses us of a notion that we might have that, we have this new view that everything's material and that everything can be explained by material causes. Look, that's a very old view. He says for as long as people have existed, there have been two views. One, that all there is what we see, and everything that has happened now has happened by chance based upon the physical reality. And then the other view is that there's something like a mind, or something more like a mind than anything else that we know behind everything that we see, driving it to be what it is in some way. And I think that's really helpful because if you read history at all, you're going to see this, that philosophers in the Greek period are saying, look, everything is physical. That's the only kind of stuff that there is. That's why, what are they arguing about in that period? A lot of the arguments are about what is everything made of? Maybe everything's made of fire. And then they talk about, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's all made of water. And that is exactly the kind of arguments that you see from that period. And so if you think that this is such a new idea that everything's physical, no, it's actually very old. And this is true. I would just encourage anyone who's interested in history, and even if you're not, to some degree, the questions will drive you back to history. Right now, the changes that we're seeing in regard to social issues, in regards to homosexuality and bisexuality and all these things. Look, if you go back to the ancient Greek world, homosexuality is accepted, but many of the problems of lack of fulfillment that people struggle with are also prevalent. But it's not that in our time we've decided people can just be free to express their sexuality in whatever way they want. Those are words you have not thought through at all. You don't want people expressing their sexuality at the gas station.
No.
Like that. But we are living in this strange time when everybody goes, no, these are the new ideas. No, they're not new.
Right.
A lot of this stuff has been tried before. It's just that we're in a lot of ways ignorant of history. And so he disabuses us of some of that ignorance. But look, these two views have always been out there. Yeah. And so know that. And then begin to question those views, because what you said is completely straightforward from the standpoint of, we have two kinds of questions. We have questions about the interior of this universe and physical questions about how things come together, and we do have answers to those things in terms of chemistry. What is a molecule of water made of? Is made of hydrogen and oxygen. Yeah, that's great that we know that. Yep. We don't know through science the existence of God. Science does things like saying, what happens when you pour Mountain Dew into a bottle with baking soda? Oh, man. Those are the kind of questions that science answers. Yeah. Science has no ability to answer questions about God, because these are a different kind of question. But look, we've had advances in science, so we as a people like science. And sure. Yeah, I'd like science too, but you need to know what science is good for and what it's not good for.
Exactly.
And again, with clear thinking, he helps to engage with that sort of thinking.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Science is pretty cool. It answers a lot of questions of how. How does this, process produce this? What does it take for this process to do this, or whatever? What is this thing composed of? It can answer a lot of really interesting questions, but it can't answer a lot of the why questions.
Right.
Or it can't really get down to the root, those major questions that we were talking about. He gives a really neat illustration. What do you think of his mailman illustration?
Oh yeah, it's great.
Where he talks about we can experience things as human beings, and therefore make inferences about what human beings experiences because we are one. He talked about the mailman, comes and goes from house to house delivering all these little packets. And he said, I don't actually know what's in all those packets as far as I've never seen what's in them, but I can understand, based on what I have experienced, deduce, I can say that what's in them is letters. Why? Because that's what I always get in my little white packets that this mailman delivers to my house. And he then says, quote, "The only packet I'm allowed to open is man. When I do, especially when I open that particular man called myself, I find that I do not exist on my own, that I am under a law. What somebody or something wants me, that somebody or something wants me to behave in a certain way." And he then makes the point, we can take that then and apply it. If it's true of me, then it is true of humanity. It's true of all people. You don't have to overcomplicate things. Right. It's just like it is, when we see, as people living in the age we do, when we see the Amazon truck going by and he gets out of his truck and he takes a box up to the door, we know that guy just delivered something that someone bought off Amazon. Not because we can see inside that box. We can't. We can only see inside the boxes we get from Amazon. But what's inside those boxes with the big smile on them? Something from Amazon.
Right.
Every single time. So then when you think about yourself, and when you truly begin to examine yourself, and you understand the reality that he's pointing to, that if you look at yourself, you will know that you are bound to a moral law. You are intended to obey and live according to a certain standard. It is not a bad deduction or inappropriate to say all human beings have the same standard that they are called to live up to. Mm-hmm. That is a perfectly rational line of reasoning that is cast out of our day. They say, no, you can live however you want, but you can't impose that upon me. Not everyone has to live according to that standard. And the actual answer is, well, yeah, I'm talking about a standard that is not just my standard, but that is the moral law, the standard that is for all human beings to live according to. And, we're already getting at this point, but the problem is we don't.
Right.
We don't live up to this moral standard correctly, which is what leads to chapter 5. You ready to get to chapter 5?
Yeah.
Chapter 5. This is the title of chapter 5. We have cause to be uneasy. The title in and of itself is great and should guide you into understanding, okay, here's the problem. There is a moral standard. There is an objective law, a standard that we have broken. Now what? Mm-hmm. We know this to be true. We know the reality that we have not lived according to the standard that we ought to. Remember, that's the difference between the law of gravity versus the moral law. It's something that we ought to live up to, but we know we don't. He has a great quote. In my book, which I have an older copy of the book, it's on page 38, but you care if I read this quote, Jackson?
Right ahead.
It's a great quote. Yeah, everyone needs to hear it. He says, it's a little bit longer, just bear with me. If it is, then we are making ourselves enemies to that goodness every day and are not in the least likely to do any better tomorrow. And so our case is hopeless again. We cannot do without it, and we cannot do with it. He's talking about the moral law here. He says, God is the only comfort. He is also the supreme terror, the thing we most need and the thing we most want to hide from. He is our only possible ally, and we have made ourselves his enemies. Some people talk as if meeting the gaze of absolute goodness would be fun. They need to think again. They are still only playing with religion. Goodness is either the great safety or the great danger, according to the way you react to it. And we have reacted the wrong way. Mm. These are really good words and really hard words as well that C.S. Lewis writes. That the fact that we have a moral standard, the fact that goodness is something that we can attain to and something we can see and something we ought to attain to is a good thing, but it also is a scary thing to recognize that we have not. And we have indeed made ourselves enemies of God. And we ought to begin asking the question then, what becomes of us then? Yeah. What becomes of that? And we have an answer, right? But I'm hogging up a lot of the air in the room. I'll let you talk a little bit.
No, it's good. It's so clear. What's so hard about this is something that's been in the back of our minds and is always in our minds about how are we doing in terms of this moral law. And it is to come face to face with the reality that's, okay, there hasn't been a day that you have followed it. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, what we typically would then do is kind of try to make some excuse so that we can live with that fact. But is goodness that good? Is the moral law that absolute? Yeah, I mean, moral objectivism is hard to come to grips with. If this is all real, that's really scary because we're not following it.
Right.
And his logic enables you to come face to face with that reality, but it puts you in the place. Again, this is exactly the situation that the Bible speaks into, because the bad news is present. It's just that we don't like to think about it.
Right.
The good news is what is given in the scriptures, but without the bad news of realizing what state we're in, the good news that there is hope doesn't come to you. I've got a quote I can throw at you from him. He says, quote, "We all like progression, getting better, but if we have stepped off the path we meant to be on and wandered away from it, progress is not to stop thinking about where we're going and continue in the same direction. Progress is going back to where we left the path and taking off on it anew. It is very clear that humanity has made a mistake on how things ought to be done, and we need to head back to the path," end quote. And that's a simple, in some ways, morality is like math. If you are hearing, and I think if you're honest, you are hearing, hey, shouldn't we all stop trying to justify that we're doing better than we are doing? Yes, we should. Yeah. That self-justification is not getting us anywhere. It is actually making us weaker and dumber. It is making us less clear in ourselves. All these justifications we make about how we're actually doing better than it may seem like, and I know it seems like I'm unreliable, but let me just tell you why it's actually I'm totally doing better than you might think I am. Oh man, the reality is that we're not doing as well as we'd like to present. But the great news is that it doesn't depend on your effort, and He's going to land us in this place to go. You got to come to grips with who you are and where you are first, though. Mm-hmm.
That's right.
And I have one more for you. Quote, "We have not yet come into contact with any religion. All we know comes from the two pieces of evidence we have. These are that the universe is ordered and beautiful, and so was made by an architectural artist. This tells us that the power is amazing, but also must be merciless and no friend to man, since the universe is also a place full of things that can harm us.
That's exactly right. That's a great quote. Like, the universe is an amazing thing, and we can look at, this is what we would call like common grace, that we can look at the world around us, at the universe,
Right.
and we can recognize that God exists. And Romans speaks to this, that everyone is without excuse, because nature itself declares the truth that there is a God. We are without excuse, because we can look around and see, man, this was created, and in fact, it was created by an artist who enjoys beauty, because this is beautiful. But at the same time, we recognize that it's also merciless and no friend to man, as he says. The universe is a place that is full of things that can harm us. And we can be easily left, if we were to sort of conclude with all of this right here, we can be left in a state of almost despair, because we're left now with a recognition that we all know that there is a moral law, and we have broken it. And that there are consequences then. And that, as from the quote I read, it is a scary thing to stand before a holy God knowing that we have broken his law. That's a scary thing. But hope is going to come. And Christianity provides hope, and it provides comfort. And there is no comfort greater, and in fact, no true comfort to be found anywhere outside of Christianity. But that comfort does not come before first we are brought to sort of the dismay, the discomfort of the reality of recognizing that we are sinners, that we have transgressed God's moral law.
Yeah.
It's not a place anyone wants to be brought to.
Right.
No one wants to be told, hey, there's a moral standard and you've totally botched it. Right. You've totally messed it up. You're a sinner. And that because you have sinned against God's moral law, his wrath is upon you. But that is the reality. That is the reality of the human condition, and we have to face that first before any comfort is going to be found.
Right.
Because those who would seek comfort exclusively are not only going to miss out on comfort ultimately, but they're also going to miss out on truth.
Yeah.
You're going to miss out on truth. You're going to miss out on comfort. But those who seek the truth, which is found only in Christ Jesus, he says in John, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Truth is found in Jesus Christ, and as he has been revealed in the Scriptures, those who seek the truth are often going to find that the path to truth involves a great deal of discomfort.
Yep.
And that is not anything that was ever guaranteed in Scripture. We're never guaranteed comfort, or in this life, we're never guaranteed comfort. But so many people seek that first and foremost at the expense of truth, and end up missing not only out on truth, but out on comfort ultimately.
Yeah.
And so that's the call of Mere Christianity. He says, I want to show you the truth. Yeah. And to get there, we have to start here, and it's uncomfortable.
Right, and there's real goodness.
Yeah.
And because there's real goodness, there's real evil.
Yeah.
And then it's just a really disarming thing to read this book, especially for the first time, but in a lot of ways every time, because we're all in the process of this. We're all in the process of being familiar with the good, not following the good. But in fact, goodness, Andrew Peterson has this line where he says, I've tried to fall when I could stand morally. That sin is insidious. Yeah. We like to, when we have to think about it, we like to think of the times when we find ourselves in a really bad situation, maybe 3 bad things happen in one day and you just lose your temper. Look, if we're honest, many of us could name sins. I dove headlong into that sin.
Yeah.
I didn't find myself at particularly a weak point. I saw it. I knew it was wrong, and I went into it.
Yeah.
That is evil.
Yeah.
And we have no more right to hurt ourselves than we do anybody else. You can think, if you begin to think of evil in the terms that are offered here, which is absolute, it brings you into a different reality, because how joyous is it if the good is real, but how terrifying is it if the evil is real? And terrifying both in you, but also in what others are capable of.
Right.
That's the real world that we live, all the way into the fact that, you and I both have little kids. Reality is harsh. Little kids will climb on things and then all of a sudden just go tumbling off, and they are learning lessons. Look, reality can be unforgiving.
Yeah. That's right.
That floor didn't get any softer just because you were falling on it.
That's right. That law of gravity that makes the rock fall out of your hand also makes my 3-year-old fall off of couches and swing sets or whatever he climbs on.
Yep.
Yeah. Man, I think we've concluded all of book 1 here, and C.S. Lewis has certainly left me saying, "Ooh, I want to know more.
Sure.
I want to know what the next step is from here, because I certainly know I have transgressed God's moral law. I know each and every one of us has, but as he said, there is hope to be found in Christianity. There is comfort to be found, but only after we come to this reality first. And so I'm thankful that he brought us there.
Yep. So that's going to close us up for book 1 of Mere Christianity, and this has been Empires of the Future.
And we will see you in the future.